Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, perhaps the greatest story ever told. We're very pleased to have you with us today, whether it's your first time or possibly even your 33rd time. I wonder whether anyone's listened to the whole set yet. My name is David Payne, and I'll be your host for this episode of our journey through Mark's Gospel, which we think is as relevant to life in the 21st century as it was to first century believers. And today it's our great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Andy Drozdziak. Andy is the news editor at Universe Catholic Weekly and the web editor with Catholic Charismatic Renewal. Is that right, Andy?
Yeah, that's right. It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? But that's right, yeah.
Great. And that Universe Catholic Weekly describes itself as a light to guide the world and a mirror to reflect it, keeping Catholics informed about their faith. So, Andy, what does that role involve for you day to day, or is it anything and everything?
Yeah, well, really, it's just about trying to share the light of the gospel in the media, trying to share stories of positivity and stories of what God's doing in the world today, really, in the lives of his people, and just trying to share that to highlight it and get it out there.
And I didn't ask you beforehand, but how do you connect with Steph's journey? How did he manage to get you, I'm sure you're very busy, onto this show?
Yeah, well, I just really through social media. I just caught up with what he was doing, and I thought, oh, that looks really interesting. And I always interested in people who do things a bit different, try and do the gospel a bit differently. And I thought, wow, that one man show looks pretty good. I was right.
Oh, thank you. Right. Great, thank you. It's lovely to have you here with us by the wonder of Zoom. Where are you? We're down in Southampton. Whereabouts in the world?
Yeah, so I live up in the northeast in a place called Barnard Castle.
Yes.
Everyone knows it now because it's the place Dominic Cummings came to when he did all that stuff. So that's where I live.
Great, lovely. I thought it was familiar from somewhere.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. I imagine our listeners either know or have heard of Stephen Smart's one man and a chair presentation of Mark's Gospel, which by this time, this is broadcast, will have been to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe for the second time. Steph, you started this podcast last summer in 2021, inviting all sorts of friends, colleagues, leaders, even news editors to discuss this amazing story, one verse at a time. I love it, but I wonder what was the thinking behind it? Why did you start it off?
I think it's just because I'm fascinated by this gospel. I normally have a Q&A at the end of my performance, and we have had some great conversations. And I thought maybe the podcast could be a way of extending that, because there seemed to be so much going on in Mark. So it was so rich. So that's the reason really, because I like talking about it with people who are similarly interested.
Brilliant, thank you. Today's reading is, I think, central to the whole book of Mark, in which Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah. But what do I know about it? It seems like a key moment of realization after the disciples have been rather slow to learn, I think it's would be fair to say. And I'm sure there'll be plenty to discuss. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Lucy Warner to read today's passage. Over to you, Lucy.
New International Version. Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus predicts his death. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, He rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns."
Thank you very much, Lucy. Well, firstly, Andy, we'll let the guest go first, shall we? What are your initial thoughts, I wonder, when you look at this passage? Is there a main point you'd like to start with?
Yeah, I think for me, as I was reflecting on this passage, I really thought that it was kind of pivotal to the whole gospel, really, in revealing the identity of Jesus and the fact that they have this exchange between Jesus and the disciples when they kind of finally get what he's been trying to say about who he is, but then get his mission. They seem to get that spectacularly wrong, and there comes about this conflict, which I think is kind of a key theme in the whole gospel. This theme of conflict and argument, where he keeps coming up against everyone, really, against the evil spirits, the demons, the teachers of the law, and then now his own disciples. He's kind of clashing with. So I think this theme of identity and conflict and argument is all in this passage. It's an amazing passage.
Yeah.
Steph, what about you? That's
I
great.
totally
Thank
agree.
you.
It sounds wonderful what you say there, Andy. Can't wait to hear more. I think for me, as I was saying earlier, it's just performing this particular passage that's really captured my attention. As a performer, what I have to do is understand why certain things are being said and certain things are being described. And I confess, sometimes it's not always clear to me. And so I've had to really consider this particular passage recently and found myself thinking, oh, I understand now. This bit falls into place. And even in the way you've just described it, Andy, that's really helped me to kind of get a picture of the fact that this is a flow of narrative. Everything fits together and has a purpose. And so when Jesus says something and the disciples respond in another way, and then he goes on to say something else, there are reasons. There's a cause and effect going on, basically. So that's the most interesting thing for me at the moment.
Great, thank you. Well, I've been out and about asking people some questions about this, or 4 questions rather, 4 comments, and some are questions, some are comments, but we'll try and fit as many of those in as we can, and do comment on what you think. So first question from one of our listeners is, why did Jesus need or want to know who people thought he was? Was he not secure in his identity?
Interesting.
Andy, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think this is a kind of classic Jesus technique. He seems to use the questions to draw these responses out of people. The other side of that is when people ask him questions, he often responds with questions too. Yeah. And I think it does go back to what we started off talking about his identity. He is the Messiah, but his approach is always invitational. He will never force those who are with him to follow him. So he's kind of inviting. He's trying to draw out one of these responses from his disciples. So he's asking these questions. Who do people say I am? And then he gets very personal. He says, who do you say I am? So I think it is. I think these questions are key to it. But I don't think he's insecure in his own identity. No. I think these 2 lines are key in this. There's "You are the Christ," which is correct, and to me that harks back to an earlier passage in Mark's Gospel, which is the baptism of Jesus, where God the Father says, "You are my son. You are my son. You are my beloved son." And both of these phrases, obviously they sum up who Jesus is. That first saying from the baptism, "You are my son," he hears these words, and then after that he's driven into the wilderness, and then he's sent out on his mission, and his mission with the disciples. And then the second one, "You are the Christ," sends him, is the start of the second part of the Gospel of Mark, and then that takes him into the suffering and the death and the passion of Jesus. So both really key moments. But yeah, I think he's totally secure in his identity, but he's trying to invite that response.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The very first verse of the book says Jesus is it tells us, lets the listeners know that Jesus is the Messiah, or rather like that, and Peter's finally caught up with us, but we're in on it from the beginning. Steph, what would you want to add to that?
I was going to say exactly that, David, I think. And also this, as Andy has hinted, this is a crucial part of the whole narrative, I think, for me. The identity of Jesus is something that's come up before. It's not the even recently Herod's been wondering who is this guy, and various people have got their thoughts. The disciples, even earlier in chapter 4 with the storm, have said, who is this? So those questions about his identity have been asked again and again, and now we've come up with an answer. But I think it's curious how the answer comes out and what people think the answer means, and that's what I think, and again Andy's mentioned already. I get the fact that talking about the first part where he asks, who do people say I am? It's interesting, all the people, they obviously get it wrong. They say he could be John the Baptist, he could be Elijah, he could be one of the prophets. But all of those responses are actually quite positive ones. That you're not getting what some of the opponents of Jesus have been saying about him. Some have said, he's possessed by the evil one, he's possessed by Beelzebub. So these are quite positive. They think he's a good guy, but they haven't really clued up as to who he really is. And it's only in this passage that someone says something approximately close to what we know is the truth.
Yeah. The next question or comment is, what did Peter actually mean by saying Jesus was the Messiah? Or Andy, you said the Christ. I'm not sure whether those are exactly the same. A friend points out that God loves it when our eyes are open and we can see the truth. Isn't that lovely? Yeah, you had said something about that, Andy, as well just now.
Yeah.
What did Peter mean by saying Jesus was the Messiah, Andy?
Yeah, so yeah, he's recognizing that Jesus is who he says he is. He is the Messiah. He's come to that revelation that, and I think it was in one of those comments from Facebook, we have that knowledge beforehand from the first verse of the whole book, he's the Messiah. But now Peter gets that he is the Messiah. And it's kind of, I think it's a kind of a double-edged sword, because he does acknowledge him, but he seems to completely misunderstand. He then immediately kind of messes it up and then starts rebuking him and starts telling him what the Messiah should be like.
Yeah, a lot of rebuking going on in the next bit, isn't there?
Yeah, loads of rebuking. And I'm fascinated at, it says, doesn't it, he took Jesus aside and started rebuking him. What was that conversation about?
I know.
How did it go? That this was Peter saying, look, this is how the Messiah should act. I know you're the Messiah, but this is how you should act. This is what you should do. And,
yes.
And I've heard that expression over the years, God makes us in his image and likeness, but we often make God in our image and likeness. Yeah. And that kind of seems to be a little bit what's going on here. Yes. And I think that's a common experience. We can try and fit God into how we want him to be.
Yeah.
But it seems to be a bit of a dangerous game.
Yeah, it's a bit like you were saying. Peter says, actually, or it says about Peter that he's got the human thoughts, but not necessarily God's thoughts. Human will, but not God's will. It's like we fall into this trap of thinking we know it all. We've got an idea of what God's all about and what he's doing. It's not always the case. In fact, in my experience, it's very often not the case. But I think, it's something we can fall into if we're not too careful. I agree. I think it's an amazing section. And yeah, I've forgotten what I was going to say now. So let's go on to the next question.
We'll move on. Well, this is my level of question.
Yeah.
Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Why? Don't need to elaborate on that, do I really?
I'll have a go at that one first.
Go on then, yeah.
Okay, so...
trying to forget the answer.
I think it's to do with what Andy just said. I think it's about misunderstanding. I don't think it comes as a surprise to Jesus, given what has happened in the rest of the gospel, that Peter has misunderstood. And so this warning is, I don't want you to tell anyone about this until you kind of understand exactly what's going on. I think there's a sense in which he knows it already. And the reason why I say that is because he's already given them a hard time about his identity. And it says quite often in Mark's gospel up to this point, the disciples' hearts were hardened. They didn't understand about the loaves. There clearly is a miscommunication here. So Peter getting it half right, you are the Christ. And perhaps we need to talk about what that means actually anyway. But getting it half right is only half right. And if you start spreading it around that the Christ is this kind of guy, this is why he's come, and that's completely wrong, that's going to put Jesus's mission in jeopardy. It's going to give completely the wrong idea. So I think that's the warning. It's quite a stern warning. It's not even a warning, I think, actually. I think as one of our correspondents on Facebook said, it's more like a rebuke. It's harsh. Do not do this. Absolutely, do not. So I think there's something in Jesus's mind here about misunderstanding.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's very much about timing. This you call it like the messianic secret. Don't tell anyone about me. And I think it's about that timing. And I was looking into this, and I heard this story about Steve Jobs when he was developing all the Apple products, the iPod, the iPad, and the iPhone. And apparently his method of working, he gathered a very small team, and that team was very close knit. And he told them, there was strict instructions not to tell anyone anything about their development, under pain of being fired, basically. And obviously now, we can see that, iPhones and Apple products fill the world. But at that point, he was saying, don't say a word. Now, I'm not comparing Apple products to the kingdom of God at all. But there was a sense of, it's not ready yet. It's not ready yet. And just as the disciples, they weren't ready. They hadn't understood. They hadn't experienced the resurrection. They hadn't experienced the infilling of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. They weren't ready. The message wasn't ready. And so he was saying, don't do it yet. Whereas later you see, go and make disciples, be my witnesses, proclaim it from all that kind of stuff. But I think it's a question of timing, and that Steve Jobs thing quite helped me a bit to understand.
I think that's great. I mean, I think, the disciples, they were clearly thinking of Scripture at this point by calling Jesus the Messiah. They were going back to Scripture and considering what has been said in the past about the Messiah. But I'm sure he knew what was the case, that they hadn't got it completely. And I think not only is it the resurrection that's the issue, I think that's a big part of it. Because I think a bit later on in the Transfiguration, he comes down the mountain and he says, don't tell anyone about what you've seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. So he kind of knew, as you say, Andy, they wouldn't get it until the end of the story. But also, I think they don't get it in terms of the sort of Messiah he is and what they're expected to do as well. And I think the rest of this up to the crucifixion, the rest of it is often teaching the disciples, hold on, the kind of life the kingdom involves is completely different to what you're thinking it is. So they really haven't got it in their heads what Messiah means. And I think for us, I think we need to consider it carefully as well. I think we're not off the hook here. For them, as far as I understand it, it's quite likely they would have seen the Messiah as someone who God has appointed to defeat Israel's enemies and set up Israel as the top nation. And this is clearly not the view that Jesus had at all, as we'll find out in a minute. So I think for us, it's also, we have to be quite careful. Who do we see Jesus as? Exactly. And be aware that we can easily fit him into our own paradigms and perspectives, rather than let him talk to us about who he really is. It's very interesting in that sense.
So do you want to, either of you want to add to that and to say, well, okay, let's think about who Jesus, and we've got all the rest of the New Testament now, lots of experience, Holy Spirit's with us. Who is Jesus? Beyond being the Messiah. We've got 25 minutes left.
big question. But I think in this passage, you know, he sees himself, doesn't he, in terms of this the suffering servant. You know, the suffering servant from the Isaiah book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. The idea that he would be the one who would go and suffer and die and rise again, and that, you know, the way of following Jesus will involve suffering as well. That, and I think that's where the tension comes. The disciples want, as we probably want, an easy life. We want to be able to, you know, cruise through life. We want the kind of Messiah who's going to give us an easy time, who's going to take all our problems away. And what he's saying is that, you know, this is going to involve pain. It's going to involve rejection. It's going to involve vulnerability. It's not going to be an easy ride.
Yes.
And he has to keep repeating, you know, he has to keep saying, you know, the Son of Man will suffer, he'll be rejected, and he'll die, and he'll rise again. So they just don't get it. But I think by extension, I often have to ask myself that question: is that what kind of Messiah do I want? You know,
exactly. Yeah, that point of where we have to come to the place of recognizing that being a Christian is not an easy life. In fact, a lot of people are not going to be very happy about our faith, and we're likely to come up against opposition. And in those days, of course, the disciples were likely to be killed, and many still today, unfortunately, are in the same boat. So being a Christian, it's full of blessings. It's full of joy and peace. We know those things from our own experience, but it's also likely to land us in trouble. It's certainly the case of Jesus. If we're going to follow him, that's what's going to happen with us as well.
Yeah, I've often thought that the symbol of our faith is quite a strange symbol, isn't it? It's a cross.
Yeah.
That's quite a violent image. You know, if you show someone a cross, and you're inviting them to become part of this journey, part of this faith, the cross is a brutal sort of image, really, isn't it? And I think there's a lot in that. And that's what, after this, Jesus then goes on to say, you know, if you want to be my follower, you've got to take up your cross. And again, it's an invitation, but, you know, you could look at it and think, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to be in pain. I don't, you know, what's the payoff? Where's the, you know, is there a wage? Is there a pension plan?
Yes, exactly.
But he says, no, it's just, you're going to suffer. You're going to be rejected.
Yeah, exactly.
But you will experience joy as well.
Sorry. Absolutely. Sorry. I think it's interesting. Maybe we'll leave this for another podcast when we get onto this passage. But I think it is true to say that the cross is the prominent feature, isn't it, in this section, and will be now for the rest of the story in Mark. Yeah. What the cross actually means for us as believers, say in our comfortable Western environment, as we all are as the guests on this podcast, is one thing. What that means for people living in persecuted parts of the church is completely another. But for us who live in relative freedom, nevertheless, I think there's a cross involved. I think perhaps in the degree in which we are prepared to give up on our own agendas and follow after God willy-nilly, you know, whether we like it or not, whether we feel happy with it, whether we feel happy to be followers rather than leaders. And I think that's what Peter's problem is here. That actually, what's most interesting for me, as I say, as a performer, is I've suddenly realized when Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," it's not necessarily as I thought. I don't want anything to do with you, Peter, now, given what you've just told me. I don't think it's that. I think it's literally get behind me, as in stand behind me, get in line. You're supposed to be a follower. It's not your job to tell me, first of all, what to do, but secondly, to say something which is completely at odds to my mission. Get back in line, get behind me. And we can talk about the reason he calls him Satan in a minute, but I think that's the key point. Peter is taking the initiative and saying, yeah, so if you are the Messiah, this is what the Messiah should be doing. Your suggestion is wrong, basically. And Jesus is saying, no, that's, if you're following me, being, you know, and if I'm the Messiah and you're my followers, this is what the Messiah means. This is what being a follower means too.
But yeah, one of the next questions was, why did Peter rebuke Jesus having only just said he was the Messiah? I don't know if you want to add to that, Andy, or I think Steph's.
No, I think
that's all right.
I think it's that as I say, that tension that he doesn't really understand, that he's been impacted maybe by, you know, an understanding of the Messiah that is radically different to that of Jesus, that the Messiah shouldn't suffer, the Messiah shouldn't experience any pain, the Messiah should lead their nation out of oppression into a new era, and Jesus just wasn't fitting into any of these categories.
You can understand though, can't you? I mean, I do feel a lot of empathy for Peter here, because if you think about it, what evidence has he got exactly that the kind of Messiah Jesus is going to be is exactly who he is? Because the Old Testament and other books that would have been around at the time, I think there's one called the Psalms of Solomon or something, were saying about the Messiah being this victorious general figure anointed by God to defeat God's enemies. So Peter's only kind of doing what he's been told, and there's never, as far as I understand it anyway, any linkage in the Old Testament, or certainly in Jewish tradition, of the Messiah with the suffering servant in Isaiah, which is what Jesus is making the link in. It's not common anyway. So Peter's ideas are, you'd understand it, absolutely. So I do feel a lot of sympathy for him. I think it's a bit unfair to castigate him too harshly.
So he's having to make a very big jump, isn't he? And it's all very unexpected.
Yeah.
So when Jesus, we'll come on to the behind me, Satan a bit now, I think. When Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan," the questioner says, what did he mean by the concerns of God? And why should Peter be expected to know what the concerns of God were? He was looking after his master shortly and just protecting his master. Not surely, sorry.
I think it's a case of, it's not so much protecting so much as Peter thinking he knows what the Messiah is all about, and he's completely surprised by the idea of Jesus dying on a cross or suffering in any way. That just completely blows all his understanding of his faith apart. So that's my answer. I think I can't think of anything else at the moment.
Yeah, I think the importance of obedience, obviously, I think Mark's gospel is all about discipleship and about being a disciple. And key feature of being a disciple, which we often overlook, I know I do, is that of obedience. So when the master speaks, we follow. When Jesus says go, we go. When he says come, we come. And I think that's what he's very stern with Peter about, that he's not following what the master's saying. He's following his own thoughts, or he's following some other kind of thoughts that are not really of God. And I do have loads of sympathy. I agree with you, Steph, that I've got loads of sympathy with Peter. He is the kind of archetypal everyman. I heard him described the other day as he's like an ordinary Joe. He gets it right sometimes, but he gets it spectacularly wrong. And I mean, in our tradition, the Catholic Church, we have the Pope is called the successor of Peter. That's his name. So Pope Francis is the one at the moment. And it's always a comfort to me to know that the leader of our church is based on someone like Peter, who has so many gifts but so many flaws, and we can really identify with Saint Peter.
Yeah.
So
quite refreshing. I got the impression that from Roman Catholics' point of view, that Peter is the paradigm of the perfect Christian, but obviously not.
well, he's a model disciple, but he's a model in the sense that he's like every one of us. He's capable of great things, but he's also very flawed. And as I say, he is. I think he's the main disciple. He's mentioned more times than all of the other disciples combined. But it is it's a great comfort that his gifts were a great blessing to the church, and he went on to become like the leader of the church and everything. But he was very, obviously his flaws were there on display for all to see. Yeah. So that gives me great comfort.
Yeah, it does. It does beg the question, though, doesn't it, Andy, about why Jesus calls him Satan?
Yes,
And
coming on to that.
it's difficult to. What do you think? What's your thought about that? It's really a surprise, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's such a strong. It's probably the most insulting word Jesus says. Is it possibly in the whole gospel?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's about this thing of thinking with the mind of the world, or the mind of Satan. You know, thinking about being at odds with the gospel, at odds with what the Messiah is doing, and
yes,
yeah, I think
at odds with what God's doing, isn't it? God's will is for the Messiah to suffer and to die and to rise again. And so anything that opposes that is obviously got to be in the other camp. I think it kind of, for me, makes that demarcation really clear. I've often wondered, I don't know if this is the case now, but I've often wondered, is Jesus himself kind of susceptible to the test that in some way that Peter's offering him? Because Jesus was tested by Satan in chapter 1 of Mark's gospel, and the other gospels kind of make it into a quite fully formed story in its own right. Jesus is under trial. Is this a moment of trial for Jesus as well? This is a question I have. I'm not sure. But certainly the idea that Peter's taking the part of the antithesis of God's will, just like the Pharisees have done, unfortunately, just like the teachers of the law have done. They've more or less made their minds up that Jesus is a bad un, and they're going to kill him. They're kind of taking that, in some ways in league with the evil one.
I think it highlights to me as well the dangers of presenting a wrong image of Jesus and who he is, and that can be very dangerous. There was this, I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, there was this message given by the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron. It was an Easter message. I remember people thinking, oh, great, the Prime Minister's giving an Easter message. This is fantastic. But what he said was very not gospel. Can I just read it? I've got it on here. It's not very long. It's just a few lines. But he said this message. He said, Easter is all about remembering the importance of change, responsibility, and doing the right thing for the good of our children. And today that message matters more than ever. It's absolutely nothing to do with the gospel, with Easter, with the mission of Jesus. And it became this message of it was just a political broadcast, basically. But in some ways, Cameron he'd recognized that Easter was about Jesus, fine, but he totally misunderstood the mission of what Jesus is about. And I thought, that could be dangerous. If you didn't know anything about Jesus and you heard that, you'd think that Christianity was this kind of grey, disinteresting kind of religion, wouldn't you? Whereas as we know, it's something that gives so much life. But we have to know who Jesus is. We have to know what his mission is. We have to know about the pain. We have to know about the joy. I think those things are so important. And so I think that's why Jesus is so passionate about getting it right, about getting this message right.
I think that's right. Really, I think that's the idea for me is about being, on the one hand, being blind, on the other hand, seeing. And you can think you know the answer, but you're probably deluded. And in the gospel, there's all sorts of kind of echoes here, aren't there, of people who've asked for healing for their eyes or their ears, and they're able to see completely. It's kind of, this is the situation with Peter, or not actually in his case. It's fascinating that just before this passage, there's a blind man who gets healed only partially, and then later on, Jesus heals him fully. It just feels that we need God's help, don't we, to understand and see properly. And you're right. If we say what we think it is, it can be incredibly dangerous. We have to be really humble and really ask for God's help and his Holy Spirit's inspiration in order to understand who Jesus is and what that means for us.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. Thank you both very much. I always like to ask our guests, Andy, to kind of enlarge, I suppose, and you have a little bit already, on how the story of Jesus applies to their lives rather than just this short passage we've given you. And it gives you an opportunity to reflect on more than the passage. What would be your response to that? What is it that grabs you about the gospel of Jesus?
I think the gospel of Jesus is just, it's pivotal to my life. But I would say that what I thought it would be like is not what it's turned out to be. Like, I kind of thought, I thought that, I had an opportunity to be a Christian for quite a few years before I actually decided to be one. And I thought when I did it, I thought, oh, now I'll do it. My life will be straightforward. It'll be easy. It'll be a bit of a walk in the park. But actually, the way it turned out it's not really like that. It's been more like a roller coaster ride, which I think, is a bit like Mark's gospel. It's a bit of a roller coaster ride.
Absolutely.
But certainly the idea of suffering, I think in my mind, my younger mind, I equated suffering with doing things wrong or getting life wrong or making mistakes or going down the wrong path. But in my life, as I've walked with Jesus, I have suffered. I have experienced times when I've been made redundant. I've been sacked. I've had something of a breakdown. My work life has been very difficult. And I remember actually when I used to be a teacher for a short time, and after that, when it just really wasn't working out for me. I couldn't keep up with the work, really. It just wasn't working. And I remember thinking, just Jesus, I was a Christian at this point, thinking that this isn't how it's meant to be. This isn't how it's meant to be. And I left. I was signed off work for weeks, really. And just remember thinking, where's Jesus? Where is he? Has it all been a myth? Has it all been a lie? And it was that actually enabled me to go really a lot deeper in my faith. And I recognized that the cross, which Jesus is talking about in this passage, this idea of suffering and pain and vulnerability, that became part of my journey. And it was actually very much part of the healing process. And I was able to go into the career I'm in now, which is journalism. But it was really an experience of pain and of loss and of just finding a new side of God that I didn't know existed. I didn't realize the crucifixion, the pain was his pain is also our pain. We share in his sufferings, so that we may have that full human experience, part of which is pain. And also obviously joy and resurrection is part of that as well. So when I'm reading Mark's gospel, I understand why he's emphasizing that, because pain is a really important part of the human experience. And if we miss that, if we miss telling people there is pain, they won't identify with us Christians. They'll think we're just floating around in some cloud somewhere. They won't be able to identify with us. But I think the message of suffering is really important.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. Thank you. Well, Andy and Stefan, thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts with us. I love the fact that every episode is so different and we get a chance to spend some time talking as friends about things that really matter. It's great that you, our listeners, have been with us too, and we hope you leave with some things to ponder. I know I've got some. Please do join us again or listen to previous episodes, which can be found on the Spotify and Apple Music platforms, and even on YouTube if you'd like to see our faces. We'd love you to like and subscribe and tell your friends if you've enjoyed today's conversation. We're so grateful to the members of the Iron Mark community group on Facebook, and also to friends who don't use social media, who I've asked on this occasion. If you're not already involved and would like to be, do follow the instructions about how to find us on Facebook and join in the conversation. Well, that's all we have time for now. So it's goodbye from Andy Drozdziak.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from Stefan Smart.
Bye.
And until next time, goodbye from me. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.